A very warm welcome, everyone, to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name's Barry Sadler, and I'd like to welcome you back if you're a regular listener, or welcome you to our podcast on all things maritime. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about quite an emotive subject, and that is the subject of abandoned seafarers. Before we talk about the reason that I am prompted to discuss this matter, let me take you back to the implementation of the Maritime Labour Convention back in 2013. The Maritime Labour Convention was seen as a real advance in seafarers' rights and standards. It started to ensure that flag states were aware of their obligation to ensure that seafarers' work, living and safety on board a ship were fair and good. It was set up to uphold some basic fundamental rights of the seafarer, and that is the right to fair terms of employment, the right to good working and living conditions, the right to medical care, and the right to have basic health and social security. Now, rights of seafarers are, of course, very, very difficult to legislate for and enforce, as various flag states will have various means and ways of ensuring that its citizens are catered for both in and out of employment. Now, here in the United Kingdom, when the Maritime Labour Convention came out, I think a lot of people looked at it and thought, well, what's new? And that's understandable. The reason it's understandable is because we're very lucky here in the United Kingdom. We have a fairly good health and social security system in place. If we become ill in the United Kingdom, we have the national health. We have a state pension. We have lots of things that we almost take for granted here in the United Kingdom as being something that we expect every single citizen in the world to have access to some form of. And it's simply not the case. In particular, it's not the case on flags of convenience and flags whose legislation does not cut it when it comes to the ability to legislate for this really, really important aspect of seafaring. Now, the IMO have addressed this in some ways. Don't forget that the Maritime Labour Convention itself, that applies to ships, was born from the International Labour Organization. And although the IMO are quite happy to adopt it, what the IMO are charged with is fundamentally its enforcement, as the Maritime Labour Convention does have standards within it that allow port state control to inspect ships with regards to compliance with the Maritime Labour Convention. Now, if I take you back to just after the Maritime Labour Convention came into force, I do remember the case of a fairly small cargo ship that had come into Southampton. It came into our old dry dock berth, and the MCA paid it a visit. Now, the MCA surveyor that visited it was one of the notorious examining surveyors in the at the MCA, and they went on board this ship and they started to do a port state control inspection. During that port state control inspection, they found 2 seafarers that had been on board the ship for over 15 months. And when they questioned these seafarers, they found that the seafarers had attempted to leave the ship and make their way home, but their attempts had been thwarted by the master and the owner. In fact, the master had removed the mobile phones from these seafarers so that they were unable to contact family, unable to contact help outside of the ship. And it was only because the port state control inspector from the MCA had gone on board the ship that these matters were highlighted. The ship was, of course, detained. the ship owner was forced to pay for and repatriate those 2 seafarers and replace them on board the ship, which the ship owner duly did, but bears the question, doesn't it? Why did the ship owner just not carry on and do it in the first place? The ship in question wasn't at the time subject to the Maritime Labour Convention, as the flag state under which it had operated had not fully ratified the convention. But the ship being in UK waters, the United Kingdom was able to use its own national legislation as the port state control body and enforce the Maritime Labour Convention upon that ship. Ship was detained, and that of course cost the ship owner a lot more money than it would have cost had that ship owner had repatriated those seafarers when their time on board had come to an end. Another story just before the Maritime Labour Convention came into effect was a story of a pilot that disembarked a tanker at the local Fawley refinery. Now, as the pilot left the ship, he was stopped by a crew member on deck who gave him a letter, and that letter was addressed to the Missions to Seamen in Southampton, and the pilot duly got in the taxi to return to the pilot station. On the way, swung past the Missions to Seamen and handed the letter to the Padre. Padre opened the letter, and the letter was a begging letter from the crew on board the ship to say that they hadn't been paid for 6 months. They'd had their mobile phones confiscated, they'd had all of their shore leave cancelled, and they were effectively prisoners on board this ship. This was pre-Maritime Labour Convention, so it wasn't so easy for the MCA, having had it reported to them, to go down and immediately detain that ship for not complying with the Maritime Labour Convention. However, the MCA did go down to the ship. They gave it a thorough port state control inspection. They were able to find multiple safety items that allowed them to detain the ship, and during the detention of the vessel, the crew issues were sorted. The Maritime Labour Convention made it a lot easier for port state control, and indeed flag states, to detain vessels and to stop them putting to sea, because it gave them the grounds under which to survey and enforce, to be able to say that because a seafarer had either not met their hours of work and rest, or because they'd literally been on the ship so long, the ship would be a danger if it went to sea, because the seafarers were tired, fatigued, their mind was not on the job, and the vessel putting to sea would in fact put everybody on board at risk. Fast forward now to just a few weeks ago, 2025, when I attended a webinar to discuss a report that has just been published. The report that had been published was an annual report from Allianz Commercial, and it was their Safety in Shipping Review of 2025. Now, there was quite a lot to say in this webinar. I've done several podcasts which have talked about some of the challenges to shipping at the moment, particularly in and around the Red Sea, Suez Canal, diversions of ships around the Cape, and other such matters that has made owning and running a ship more of a challenge at the moment than perhaps it would normally be. The geopolitical situation in the world since this webinar has actually deteriorated somewhat, with there being the potential for peace in Ukraine, which may or may not happen, and the situation in the Middle East deteriorating further with regards to the actions by Israel and Palestine. So geopolitically, we are in a very, very delicate place. And it's not surprising that insurance companies are feeling the heat a little bit. They're paying out on claims that are being made by ship owners where the risks to the ships have been greatly increased by either their passage through an area that is a war zone, or their increased passage times and lengths around the Cape of Good Hope, avoiding the Red Sea and the troubles that are currently happening there. The retention of older tonnage in order to make these longer voyages has been evident. And the trouble with the older tonnages on the longer voyages is that they are subject to much more claims. Claims on delays, claims on damage to the ship, claims on the hull and machinery, where machinery, although it may have been maintained, is so old that the long passage around the Cape of Good Hope would result in claims from failures of the machinery and therefore delays made to the ship. So I listened to this webinar, and the speaker very, very accurately and from a position of extreme knowledge talked about how the risks have increased, how the losses have decreased, but the risk had increased to ship owners and indeed underwriters when it came to the commercial viability of world shipping. Then all of a sudden some numbers appeared on the screen, and the number that took me aback was the number of abandoned seafarers in 2024. Number of abandoned seafarers in 2024 had risen 87% on 2023 to 3,133 seafarers. That is a staggering number. And although it was talked about briefly within the webinar, the number jumped out at me and stuck in my mind as we continued talking about the other risks. 3,133. So I tried to sort of equate that to something. And these new big mega cruise ships that sort of circa 170, 180,000 gross tons have crews of around 1,600, 1,700 on board. So if you think about it, that's two full crews for mega cruise ships abandoned in 2024. So 3,133 seafarers were either left on ships that were decaying and rotten, not paid, not given food, not repatriated back to their home country, or a combination of all three of those things. Equally as shocking was the number of vessels that were abandoned by their owners in 2024. That was 312, up a staggering 136% on 2023, where only 132 vessels were abandoned by their owners. So that's another staggering figure. Another one that came out was 28 ships were abandoned by multiple crews in the same year. Should really put that round the other way. 28 ships had multiple crews abandoned in the same year. So literally, a ship abandoned its crew, the crew were finally repatriated, left the ship was recrewed, only to have that new crew abandoned as well. And that happened to 28 ships in 2024. This is staggering. I excuse me. I was under the impression that the Maritime Labour Convention was working for seafarers. That in general, as a pilot in the port of Southampton, I had started to see the number of really dirty, poorly run ships decrease. The ships coming to Southampton were cleaner. The crews appeared to be happier. The crews were provided with internet connections and social mobility. The crews were fed well. The food that I was provided with on the bridge of some of these ships was of excellent quality. So, as a pilot boarding a ship, I saw an increase in the standards that seafarers were living to on board the ships. But, having seen these numbers in this webinar, it was quite obvious to me that somewhere along the way, something had gone really, really wrong. Reasons that seafarers are abandoned on ships are normally due to things like bankruptcy or sanction issues, communication issues, wage issues, the ship owner not being able to find the means to repatriate, various reasons why seafarers are abandoned on board ship. But I think the real reason that seafarers are abandoned is because fundamentally we do not have, in certain parts of the world, the port state involvement that we have here in the UK to enforce the Maritime Labour Convention and ensure that seafarers on ships are paid properly, fed properly, and repatriated when they have the right to be. Now, the International Maritime Bureau said that 126 seafarers were taken hostage in 2024, which is almost the double the 73 reported in 2023 and 41 in 2022. Now, this is also indicative of some of the problems that are being experienced in the Red Sea, and some of those numbers, but not many, 126 of that 3,133, were perhaps not the ship owner's fault, in that being taken hostage was beyond the control of the ship owner themselves. Some of you may remember that 25 crew of the vehicle carrier Galaxy Leader were finally released in January 2025 after being taken hostages by the Houthi movement in the Red Sea as the ship sailed from Turkey to India. They are, of course, counted amongst the 3,133 crew that were detained or abandoned far from home last year. So what are the obligations of a ship owner? What must the ship owner do? Well, the ship owner has an obligation to repatriate a seafarer as and when that seafarer has a right to be repatriated. A seafarer has a right to be repatriated when their contract has come to an end, when they are going on leave as per their contract, when they are leaving the ship for medical reasons, if they are leaving the ship because the contract has been mutually cancelled, or if either party has been given notice on the contract. By contract we mean the Seafarer's Employment Agreement, of course. If the ship is proceeding to a war zone and the seafarer does not wish to go to that war zone, the seafarer has a right to be repatriated. So a ship owner that sends the ship through the Red Sea should really be repatriating those seafarers that don't want to go through there. This requirement, however, does sometimes make the international community slow at declaring that a war zone actually exists. And that's a sad thing as well, because that does mean that a seafarer feels compelled to go through these danger zones, even though they don't really wish to. Now, these rights of a seafarer to be repatriated are at the expense of the ship owner. Now, there are times, of course, when the ship owner may be exonerated from their obligation to repatriate a seafarer. They may be exonerated from those obligations when the seafarer goes missing for more than 3 months and their whereabouts is unknown. If the seafarer tells the ship owner in writing that they do not require repatriation. If the seafarer refuses the reasonable offer of repatriation from the ship owner, or if the seafarer, of course, is deceased. It's worth noting that if the seafarer is deceased, then the ship owner would have an obligation to assist in the financial return of the body to the next of kin as required by the Maritime Labour Convention. Repatriation is, of course, to the expense of the ship owner, and therefore any costs involved, travel, accommodation, food whilst en route, should all be to the expense of the ship owner. Repatriation of seafarers is considered to be such an important facet of being on a ship that the Maritime Labour Convention requires compulsory insurance to ensure that a ship owner is able to do this, regardless of whether the ship owner has the money to do so. So basically, civil liability for the repatriation of seafarers is a requirement of the Maritime Labour Convention. So a ship owner must seek underwriting to repatriate seafarers, and a certificate must even be provided by the insurance company to say that seafarers have that civil liability in place, and should the business fail, should the ship founder, should the ship owner abandon them, that the P&I Club would pick up the bill for repatriation and ensure that those seafarers are returned home. Now, the Maritime Labour Convention, of course, deals with a lot of other issues surrounding seafarer detention on board. The Maritime Labour Convention requires, for instance, that seafarers are provided with fresh water and food, that the food is nutritional, that it is culturally acceptable, it varies, that it's not the same every day, and that ultimately the food that is provided to the seafarer ensures their health and well-being on board the ship. Recreational facilities should be provided by the ship owner. That's another facet of being on board the ship, perhaps not directly associated with abandoned seafarers, but nonetheless, it's there. And perhaps most importantly, the payment of wages is controlled by the Maritime Labour Convention. And payment of wages must be regular. The seafarer must know how much they're being paid. The seafarer must receive statements as to how much they're being paid, what deductions, if any, have been made from the seafarer's wage. And the Maritime Labour Convention even insists that any deductions from a seafarer's wage, such as tax, national insurance and things like this, are legislated for by the individual flag states. It is important to recognise, however, that as these ships sail through some waters, port state control do not enforce the Maritime Labour Convention on some vessels. Now, there are multiple examples that have been put out in the media as to seafarers that have been abandoned for months, sometimes years, on ships which are deteriorating and have been left to operate in areas where the port state control do not have the resources or the drive to enforce the Maritime Labour Convention. 90% of abandoned seafarers last year sailed under flags of convenience, with the top flag of convenience offenders including Panama, Palau, Tanzania, the Comoros Islands, Cameroon and Bahrain, with vehicles occasionally flying no identifiable flags, a ship sometimes with flags that actually can't be identified as a flag state. Flags like that provide minimal oversight, which enable ship owners to evade their liability and accountability for seafarers and leaving them on board the ships. Port state complicity, however, is one of the greatest factors involved in the abandonment of seafarers. The United Arab Emirates emerged as the port state with the most abandonments. 42 vessels in the United Arab Emirates were abandoned in 2024, with 25 vessels in Turkey. So port states in these areas aren't put together in a way that shares data effectively to allow these ships to be unearthed. Turn a blind eye to them, mainly because they have areas within ports where ships can berth and are exempt from things like tax and exempt from other particular inspections such as port state control and the ability to enforce the Maritime Labour Convention. There have, of course, been calls for action internationally. The ILO and IMO legal committees have, in December 2024, called urgently for better coordination amongst port flag and coastal states, as well as stronger protection over wages, medical care and repatriation, which led to guidelines being adopted in 2024, ensuring that the Maritime Labour Convention is adhered to. The IMO itself has developed the International the implementation of international instruments, the III Code, as a way of auditing flag states to ensure that their legislation, including their Maritime Labour Convention legislation, is up to scratch and protects the seafarers in the way that the convention was designed to do. The International Transport Federation and other maritime welfare bodies continue their advocacy, recovering unpaid wages and pushing for stronger enforcement and accountability, backed up by some of the church-driven organisations throughout the world, such as Stella Maris, that assist seafarers that find themselves in this predicament. 2024 was one of the worst years so far for the abandonment of seafarers, and a lot of this is being put down to global insecurity at the moment and the fact that the geopolitical situation in multiple parts of the world is very, very delicate at the moment. So let's hope that in the near future a lot of these geopolitical worries go away and the ship owner can run their ship with a lot more certainty and a lot less risk that allows them lower insurance costs, lower fuel costs, and the ability to repatriate seafarers without giving it a second thought. The ability to ensure that the seafarer's employment agreement that the seafarer entered into in good faith can be met financially by the ship owner so that they do not rely upon their underwriting insurance. Hopefully this is a prod to those port states that do not enforce the Maritime Labour Convention that they will be ousted. The numbers are there, and insurance companies will keep a close eye on where all the claims come from and what part of the world they do. And that will push up the insurance costs for ships visiting those parts of the world, which means that ship owners are less likely to want to put their ships to that part of the world, meaning that goods within those countries will start to increase in their cost, mainly because they have to be imported through other means. Shipping is quite simply the cheapest way to import goods into your country. I hope you've enjoyed this insight into the abandonment of seafarers. The numbers are scary. Let's hope that we have peaked in 2024, and when the same risk report comes out in 2025, it shows a much needed reduction in the number of seafarers that have been abandoned. Spare a thought for them, guys. It's really difficult for a seafarer that's been abandoned to get help. Hopefully, as long as flag states and port states take their responsibility seriously, let's hope that things get better in 2025. Thanks for listening, everyone. I look forward to welcoming you back to the Maritime Education Podcast in the near future. In the meantime, everyone, do have a great day.